I told my father his way of doing business was finished. He said I might be right. He was still doing it anyway, just not where I could see. I told my father his way of doing business was finished. We were standing in his office at the original lot, the one with the water-stained ceiling tile he'd never gotten around to replacing in 30 years. Morning light coming through the blinds and catching the dust on his old metal desk, and I laid out, as plainly as I knew how, that the character-based underwriting he'd built this dealership on, sizing up a customer's reliability by sitting in their kitchen rather than pulling a credit score, had no place in a business our size anymore. I told him the algorithm I'd spent 8 months building would do it better, faster, and without the risk of one man's gut feeling costing us a bad loan. He listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he always did, hands folded on the desk in front of him, and when I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "You might be right, Marcus." That was all. No argument, no defense of 40 years of doing it his way. I drove home that night certain I'd finally dragged this business into a decade it could survive in. I didn't understand, not then, that the quiet way he'd agreed with me wasn't agreement at all, and that 18 months later, a woman from our own lender's audit team would be the one to show me exactly how wrong I'd been. Using numbers my father had been keeping to himself the entire time. My name is Marcus Pruitt. I'm 39. I run Pruitt Auto Group, 3 used car lots, across 2 counties that my father built starting in 1985, and I've spent the last decade trying to modernize a business that, by every metric I could see, was running on instinct rather than data. I have a wife, Renee, 2 kids in elementary school, and a younger sister, Beth, who handles our office administration and has always had a sharper read on our father than I've given her credit for, mostly because she's never carried the pressure of running the business herself. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened, because I've come to believe that a story like mine only means what it's supposed to mean if you tell it in sequence, without skipping to the part that stings. I should say, before I go further, that I've never doubted my father loved this business, or that he loved doing right by the people who walked onto his lot with nothing but a need and a story. What I doubted, for a long stretch of my adult life, was whether that love could scale, whether the thing that made him good at this in 1985 could still matter in an industry that had moved almost entirely toward automated risk assessment by the time I took over. I want to be honest about that doubt rather than pretend it wasn't real, because pretending it wasn't real would make the rest of this account dishonest in a way I'm not willing to be, even now, even knowing how the story ends. This isn't a confession dressed up as an apology, it's an account, and I intend to give it to you plainly, including the parts where I was certain I understood something I didn't understand at all. My father, Roland Pruitt, opened his first lot in 1985 with 6 cars and a hand-lettered sign, financing every sale himself because no bank in our county would touch the kind of customers who came to him, men and women with bad credit, no credit, or a bankruptcy a few years behind them. People the rest of the industry had written off as too risky to bother with. My father didn't use a credit score to decide who he'd finance. He drove to their house. He sat at their kitchen table, met their kids, looked at how they kept their yard, talked to them about their job and what had gone wrong the last time money got tight, and made a judgment about whether they'd pay him back that had nothing to do with a 3-digit number and everything to do with 40 years of reading people, a skill he'd started developing long before the dealership. Back when he worked collections for a furniture store in his 20s and learned, he always said, more about human nature knocking on doors than he ever learned in any classroom. He had one habit that everyone who worked for him eventually came to respect. He never approved a loan the same day he met a customer. He used to say the collections job taught him something no business school ever could, that people rarely lie about the big things, the job, the marriage, the reason they were behind. They lied, if they lied at all, about the small things, the exact date they'd get paid, whether they had savings tucked away somewhere they hadn't mentioned. He learned to listen for those small inconsistencies the way a mechanic learns to hear an engine that's about to fail before the dashboard light ever comes on, a skill nobody had taught him so much as he'd simply accumulated it, door by door, argument by argument, repossession by repossession, until he decided he'd rather build something that helped people keep their cars than a career built on taking them away. He always said he needed to sleep on a person before he trusted them with 4 figures of his own money, and more than once I watched him turn down a sale that looked good on paper because something about the way a man answered a question at his kitchen table didn't sit right. A hesitation before answering how long he'd been at his current job. An unwillingness to make eye contact when the conversation turned to past debts. His default rate, going back decades, sat consistently under 4%, a number competitors who ran on hard credit criteria alone could never touch. Though I'd come to understand, much later, that I'd spent years crediting that number to luck rather than method. There's one story about my father I think about often now. One he only told once, at a company Christmas party years before any of this began. Half to the room and half to himself. The kind of story that only comes out once enough eggnog and enough years have made it feel safe to tell. In 1993, a young single mother named Carol Reyes came to him needing a car to get to a new job. No credit history to speak of, having just left an abusive marriage with nothing but 2 kids and a duffel bag. Every other lot in town had turned her away outright. My father drove to the shelter where she was staying, sat with her in a common room because she had no kitchen table of her own yet, and financed her a car anyway, on nothing but a read of her situation that most lenders would have called reckless. She paid that loan off early, came back 11 years later to buy a second car for her oldest daughter, and referred no fewer than 6 other customers to my father over the following 2 decades, each of whom he financed using the exact same method. He told that story once, at that Christmas party, not as a boast but as an answer to a young loan officer who'd asked him, half joking, how he slept at night approving loans banks wouldn't touch. I found out much later, going through the same 41 names Denise had flagged, that Carol Reyes was one of them, still on my father's private list of people he checked in on nearly 3 decades after that first loan. Her name written in his ledger in the same steady hand as everyone else's. No different in his eyes, it seemed, from a customer he'd financed the week before. When I mentioned to him that I'd noticed her name, he only said that Carol had never once been late on anything in her life, and that some debts, the kind that matter, don't get repaid in dollars so much as in the fact of a life that turned out all right. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it under sentiment, the way I filed most of his stories, when it turned out to be the clearest explanation he ever gave me for a method I'd later tell him, to his face, was finished. By the time I took over daily operations in my early 30s, after 6 years managing our second lot and watching the business survive 2 recessions on the strength of my father's read of people, I believed with real conviction that his approach had become a liability rather than an asset. We'd grown to 3 lots and a loan book of nearly 400 active accounts. Far more than one man could personally vet no matter how many kitchen tables he sat at, and my father, well into his 60s by then, was still trying to personally interview every single applicant himself. A bottleneck that had cost us real sales during our busiest seasons when customers walked to a competitor rather than wait 3 days for my father to find time to visit their house. I spent 8 months building a credit scoring model with a data consultant, pulling in bureau data, employment verification, banking history, and payment patterns from our own historical loan book, confident that a system built on thousands of data points would outperform one man's instinct, however good that instinct had proven to be. I told myself, and I told my wife, Renee, more than once over dinner, lying awake some nights running through the same justification until it felt solid enough to sleep on, that this wasn't about dismissing what my father had built. It was about scaling a good idea past the limits of what one person could manage. That belief had real substance behind it. It was also, I'll admit, considerably easier to hold on to than the version where I simply wanted to run this business the way I understood business should be run, on numbers I could defend in a boardroom, rather than a feeling my father couldn't fully explain even to himself. The conversation happened on a Tuesday morning in March, in my father's office at the original lot. The one with the water-stained ceiling tile from a roof leak he'd patched himself back in the 90s rather than pay a contractor, a fix that had held for nearly 30 years despite every warning from every roofer who'd ever looked at it. I'd requested the meeting formally, which was unusual enough between us that I could tell he understood something significant was coming before I said a word. the way he always seemed to know things before anyone told him outright. I laid it out for him the way I'd laid it out for our board the week before, that the algorithm was ready, that a pilot run against 18 months of historical applications had shown it would have approved substantially the same loans he had, faster and with full documentation, and that I thought it was time to retire the manual underwriting process entirely, including his personal home visits, in favor of the automated system across all 3 lots. I told him, as gently as I knew how, that his way of doing business, the kitchen table method that had built this company from 6 cars to 3 lots, was finished, that the industry and the scale we now operated at had simply outgrown what one man's judgment could manage, no matter how good that judgment had been. My father listened to the whole thing without interrupting, sitting behind the same metal desk he'd bought secondhand in 1986 for $40 from a liquidation sale, a fact he still liked to mention whenever anyone commented on how battered it looked, his hands folded in front of him the way they always were when he was considering something carefully rather than reacting to it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, long enough that I started rehearsing a second version of the argument in case I needed it, running through the pilot data again in my head, ready to cite specific approval rates if he pushed back. Then he nodded slowly and said, "You might be right, Marcus." He didn't defend the 40 years behind him. He didn't ask a single question about the model's accuracy or its blind spots, the kind of question I'd half expected and had prepared answers for. He simply stood, said he had a customer coming in at 10, and asked whether I wanted him to keep doing the home visits for the rest of the month while the new system finished testing, or whether I wanted to switch over immediately. I told him immediately was fine. He said, "All right," and that was the entirety of it. No negotiation, no counteroffer, nothing that would have given me a single reason to slow down even if I'd been looking for one. I've wondered since whether some part of him wanted me to slow down anyway, to ask one more question before I walked out of that office, and whether his silence in that moment was as much a test as it was acceptance, a test I failed simply by not thinking to ask what I would have needed to hear. My sister Beth was in the building that morning, helping our office manager with some filing, and she caught the tail end of the conversation through the open door. She found me in the parking lot afterward and asked, arms crossed against the March wind, whether I understood what I'd just done, whether I'd actually asked Dad what he thought, or just informed him the way you'd inform an employee of a policy change. I told her he'd had every chance to push back and hadn't, that a man who disagreed as strongly as she seemed to think he would have said so, that Dad had never once in my life been shy about telling me when he thought I was wrong. Beth looked at me for a long moment and said, "He's not going to fight you on something like this, Marcus. That's never been how he handles things he thinks you're wrong about." I've thought about that sentence a lot since the audit, turning it over the way you turn over something you should have understood the first time you heard it. Beth had grown up watching our father the same way I had, but somewhere along the way she'd learned to read his silences as content rather than absence. While I'd spent years reading them as agreement simply because agreement was easier to build a business plan around than the alternative, that a quiet man might be holding an entire second opinion he had no intention of spending on an argument he already suspected he'd eventually win without one. I told her she was reading too much into a routine operational change. I believed that completely at the time, and I remember feeling faintly irritated that she'd complicated something I considered settled, and honestly, something I'd felt genuinely good about handling professionally rather than emotionally. The 18 months that followed were, by nearly every number I was tracking, the strongest stretch the business had ever posted. The automated underwriting system cut our loan processing time from an average of 3 days down to under 2 hours. Our sales volume climbed sharply as customers stopped walking to competitors while waiting on my father's schedule, and we closed a warehouse credit facility with a regional finance partner, Meridian Capital Partners, that let us scale our loan book well beyond what we could have financed out of pocket the way my father always had. I gave a presentation to Meridian's underwriting team about how Pruitt Auto Group had modernized its risk assessment, walking through the model's architecture with a confidence that felt entirely earned at the time, and I didn't mention my father's name once in that presentation. A detail I didn't register until much later, rereading my own slide deck after everything else had happened. I'd spent nearly 2 weeks preparing that presentation, building slide after slide of approval rates and processing times. Practicing the delivery in front of Renee at the kitchen table the way I'd once watched my father practice nothing at all before a customer walked through his door. I remember feeling, standing in front of Meridian's team that day, a particular kind of pride at having built something entirely my own, a system with my name on the patent filing rather than my father's on a handshake, and it's that specific memory, more than almost any other from those 18 months, that I've had the hardest time sitting with since the audit. Because I understand now how much of what I was proud of that day depended on evidence I hadn't actually finished gathering. My father came into the original lot most days, still worked the sales floor with customers, still had a rapport with people that none of my younger sales staff could match, greeting regulars by name and asking after their kids the way he always had. But he no longer conducted home visits, no longer reviewed loan applications, and never once, in all that time, brought up the change we'd made in his office that March morning. I took his silence as confirmation that he'd made his peace with it, that whatever pride might have taken a hit had settled into acceptance the way most things eventually did with him. There were 3 things, small things, that I noted during that stretch and didn't think much of until they mattered. The first was that summer, when my father mentioned, almost in passing at Sunday dinner while reaching across the table, that he'd started doing a little private financing on the side for a handful of customers he'd known for years. People who'd been with him since the early days of the business, using some of his own retirement savings rather than the dealership's capital. I asked him how many customers that involved. "A few dozen," he said, and reached for the salt, not elaborating further, the same unhurried tone he used for nearly everything. I didn't press, assuming it was a small, sentimental gesture toward longtime customers, something closer to a hobby for a man easing out of daily operations than anything that mattered to the business itself. The second was that fall, when I noticed my father was still occasionally driving out to visit people in the evenings, something our office manager mentioned in passing when she said he'd asked her to print a handful of addresses from our old customer files, names I didn't recognize from our current active loan book, people who'd paid off their cars years earlier and, as far as I knew, had no remaining business with us at all. I asked him about it. He said he liked to check in on some of his old customers now and then, make sure they were doing all right, and that it kept him occupied in the evenings now that he wasn't doing home visits for the business anymore. I remember thinking it was a mildly touching, slightly inefficient use of a retired man's time. And I didn't think to ask any further questions about who exactly he was visiting, or why, glad, if anything, that he had something to fill his evenings with, now that the business no longer needed him the way it once had. One of those names, I'd learn much later, belonged to a man named Ellis Whitfield, a former mill worker who'd financed a truck through my father back in 2009 after losing his job in a round of layoffs, a loan my father had approved despite a credit report that showed almost nothing but red. Ellis had since remarried, started a small landscaping business of his own, and was, by the time of the audit, one of the 41 names in that private ledger, still being visited by my father, not because he owed anything, but because my father simply liked to check on people he'd once bet on, the way you'd check on a garden you'd planted years ago to see if it had taken root the way you'd hoped. The third was smaller still, my father mentioned. One evening that winter, while we were closing up the original lot together, the two of us doing the same walkthrough we'd done together 1,000 times since I was old enough to hold a set of keys, that he'd been keeping a little book on the side, a phrase he delivered the way he delivered most things he considered his own business, and not worth elaborating on. I asked if he needed anything from me on it. He said no, it was small, and that it wasn't anything that would mean much to anyone but him. Then he asked whether I thought the used inventory on the back row needed to be detailed again before the weekend rush, which was his way of ending a conversation he considered finished. None of these 3 things alarmed me. Each one, taken alone, was the kind of unremarkable detail that fills the space of an ordinary year for a man easing into a quieter role in a business he'd spent decades building. Some private financing for old friends, some evening visits, a personal ledger. It was only much later that I understood they weren't separate at all. and that each of them pointed toward the same thing: my father. Quietly and on his own initiative, continuing to do the one part of this business I had told him, to his face, was finished. The turn came on a Thursday in September, roughly 18 months after that March conversation in his office, during a routine annual audit Meridian Capital Partners conducted on our warehouse credit facility, standard procedure for any dealership financing loans at our volume through their line. The auditor, a sharp, unhurried woman named Denise Okafor, came out to review our full loan book. And midway through her second day, she asked to speak with me and my father together, a request that struck me as unusual enough that I remember checking my calendar twice to make sure I wasn't missing something obvious about why he needed to be in the room, since he hadn't touched an underwriting decision in a year and a half as far as I knew. Denise laid 2 spreadsheets on the conference table, side by side, the fluorescent light overhead humming the way it always did in that room. The first was our primary loan portfolio, the one underwritten by the algorithm I'd built, showing a delinquency rate that had crept up over the past year to just under 11%, a number considerably worse than our historical average, and high enough. Denise explained that Meridian's own risk committee had flagged our facility for a covenant review that could result in a reduced credit line or a repricing of our borrowing costs, either of which would meaningfully hurt our margins going into the next fiscal year. I'd known, in a vague way, that our delinquency numbers had been drifting upward over the past several quarters, but I'd attributed it to broader economic pressure on our customer base rather than anything specific to the model itself, the kind of explanation that let me keep believing the system was sound even as the evidence quietly accumulated against it. Looking back, there had been signs before Denise ever walked through our door: a slightly longer average time to first missed payment, a slightly higher rate of repossessions in our newest cohort of loans, signs I'd noted in passing during our own internal reviews and filed away as noise rather than pattern, the same way I'd filed away my father's private financing as sentiment rather than method. The second spreadsheet was a portfolio of 41 loans Denise had found during her review of our historical files. Loans that didn't run through our primary system at all, financed instead through a separate account my father had opened using his own personal capital, underwritten entirely by his own manual process. The home visits, the kitchen table judgment, the same method I'd told him was finished 18 months earlier. That portfolio's delinquency rate across the entire 18 months sat at 0. I sat with that for a long moment before I said anything, staring at the 2 numbers side by side as though staring longer might change one of them. Denise explained that she'd only found the second portfolio because my father, thorough as always, had kept meticulous handwritten records of every one of those 41 loans in a ledger he'd shown her without hesitation when she'd asked routine questions about our historical underwriting practices. Records that were, in her words, cleaner and more complete than the automated system's own documentation in several places, dates and payment histories logged by hand with a precision that put our own digital records to shame. She told us, looking mostly at my father, that in 20 years of running these audits, she'd rarely seen a zero delinquency book of that size, and that whatever process had produced it deserved more attention than a footnote in an otherwise concerning report. Denise stayed another hour after that, going through my father's ledger page by page with an interest that went well beyond what her job required, asking him questions about specific entries, how he'd assessed a particular customer's job stability, why he'd waited 3 weeks on one application before approving it. She told me afterward, catching me alone in the hallway before she left for the day, that she'd spent 2 decades building models not unlike the one I'd built, and that she'd never once seen a manual process outperform an algorithm this consistently at this kind of volume. Usually when I see something like this, she added, packing up her laptop, it's because somebody got lucky on a small sample. 41 loans over 18 months with 0 delinquency isn't luck. That's a method. You should find out what it is before you decide you don't need it anymore. I asked my father, once Denise had stepped out to give us a moment, how long he'd been running that portfolio, and why he'd never told me. He looked at me for a moment, the same unhurried look he'd given me in his office 18 months earlier, and said, You asked me to stop doing it for the business, Marcus. You didn't ask me to stop doing it for people I still trusted. I sat with that phrasing for a while after he said it, turning it over the way you turn over a distinction you should have made yourself. He hadn't defied me. He hadn't quietly rebuilt the thing I'd dismantled out of spite or stubbornness. He'd simply drawn a line I'd never thought to draw myself, between what belonged to the business and what belonged to him. And he'd stayed entirely on his own side of it for 18 months, using his own money, his own evenings, his own judgment, never once crossing back over into territory I'd claimed as mine. I asked whether he'd known, back when I told him his method was finished, that the algorithm might struggle the way it had. He said, simply, I didn't know it would fail. I knew a machine can't sit at somebody's kitchen table. I wasn't going to argue with you about that. I was just going to keep doing the part of this business that still needed a person to do it. A distinction he delivered as plainly as he delivered everything else, as though it should have been obvious to me all along. That was the fact that reframed everything. The confidence I'd built my entire modernization story around, the presentation to Meridian where I'd never once credited my father, the 18 months I'd spent believing I'd proven his old-fashioned method obsolete. None of it accounted for the 41 loans sitting quietly in a personal ledger, financed with his own money, using the exact method I'd retired. Producing a result the algorithm couldn't touch. I hadn't proven him wrong, I'd simply stopped looking at the evidence he was still quietly generating, because I'd already decided, before I ever asked him a single question, what the answer was going to be. I told Renee everything that night, sitting on the back steps of our house after the kids were asleep. The 2 spreadsheets still burning in my memory more than any single number I'd looked at in years. She listened without interrupting, the way she always does, and then asked me the question I hadn't let myself ask directly: whether I thought my father had built that second portfolio as a kind of insurance policy against me, anticipating that the algorithm might eventually fail, or whether he'd simply never been able to stop doing the one thing he'd always done, regardless of what I'd told him about it. Renee had met my father a handful of times before we married, back when Renee's own father, a career accountant, had spent a full evening quizzing him about default rates and loss ratios at our engagement dinner, treating the conversation almost like a due diligence exercise on the family she was marrying into. My father had answered every question patiently, in numbers Renee's father clearly hadn't expected a small-town used car dealer to have memorized, and Renee told me once, years later, that her own father had said afterward that Roland Pruitt understood risk better than half the loan officers he'd worked with in 30 years at his bank. I hadn't thought about that comment in years until the night I told her about the audit, and it struck me, sitting on those back steps, how long the evidence of what my father actually understood had been sitting in plain sight, waiting for me to take it seriously. I told her I didn't know, and that I wasn't sure it mattered which one was true. Either way, he'd protected something I hadn't known needed protecting, and had done it without once making me feel small for having missed it, until an auditor from our own lender had to be the one to show me what my own father had been quietly proving for a year and a half. I drove out to see him that Saturday and found him at the original lot, going over the ledger at his old metal desk under the same water-stained ceiling tile, the book open in front of him with 41 names, written in a hand I recognized from every report card and birthday card he'd ever signed, the pages worn soft at the corners from being handled so often. He didn't stop what he was doing when I came in, though he closed the ledger once I started talking. I told him the first thing plainly, because I believed it deserved to be said plainly, that I had misjudged him, not because I thought his instincts had genuinely become obsolete, but because I had mistaken his quiet agreement in that office for actual agreement, when in fact he'd simply decided not to argue with a decision he'd already known, from experience, would eventually prove itself wrong without his help. I told him I'd spent 18 months believing I'd modernized a business past the point where his judgment mattered, when the truth was his judgment had been quietly outperforming everything I'd built the entire time, unseen, unbilled, unclaimed. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when I finished, he set his hand flat on the closed ledger and said, You told me my way was finished, Marcus. I wasn't finished. I just stopped arguing about it where you could hear me. It wasn't delivered with any edge. It was delivered the way he delivered a judgment on a customer at his kitchen table, plain and complete. Uninterested in whether I found it comfortable to hear. I asked him, and I heard something in my own voice I didn't especially care for. Why he hadn't told me directly. Why he'd let the audit be the thing that surfaced it, rather than simply showing me the ledger himself at any point over the past 18 months, at any Sunday dinner, any evening closing up the lot together. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the closed book under his hand, and then he said, "You'd already decided what my judgment was worth before you asked me. I wasn't going to spend what was left of it convincing you. I was going to spend it on people who still needed it." I asked whether he'd ever thought about using this to prove a point, to correct me in front of the board, in front of Meridian, in front of anyone who might have questioned whether I'd overreached in cutting him out, whether some part of him had wanted the satisfaction of being proven right in a room full of people. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "I wasn't waiting to be right, son. I was waiting to see if you'd ask me again before the numbers made you." That was the whole of it. He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask him to. Some sentences carry more weight for what they refuse to spend on themselves, and I understood, sitting in that office with the ledger between us, that this was as close as my father was ever going to come to telling me he'd never actually stopped doing the work. Only stopped doing it where I could see it. I called Beth on the drive home, mostly to tell her she'd been right in that parking lot 18 months earlier, a concession I owed her and had been putting off since the audit. She didn't gloat about it, which somehow made it harder to say than if she had. She only asked whether I thought Dad had known, back in that March meeting, exactly how this would eventually play out. Or whether he'd simply been the kind of man who keeps doing what he believes in, regardless of whether anyone thinks to ask him to stop. I told her I didn't know, and that I wasn't sure it mattered which one was true. That either way, he'd protected something none of us had known needed protecting, and had done it without once making any of us feel small for having missed it. Until the day an audit finally forced the numbers into a room neither of us could argue with. The weeks that followed, I did the concrete work rather than the emotional kind, because I understood by then that with my father, actions had always mattered more than sentiment, and that this was a trait I'd inherited from him without ever properly crediting the source. I had our operations team formally reintegrate a manual underwriting track alongside the algorithm, not as a replacement, but as a parallel process for the accounts where a human read still outperformed the model. With my father, at his own insistence and mine, training 2 younger managers in the kitchen table method he'd built the business on, spending whole afternoons walking them through what to listen for, what a hesitation actually meant, versus simple nerves. Making sure the judgment itself wouldn't disappear with him whenever he finally did step back for good. I went back to Meridian myself, alongside Denise's report, and presented the full picture honestly, that our strongest performing segment of loans over the past 18 months had come from a process I'd told my own father was finished, and that going forward. Our risk model would incorporate exactly the kind of judgment I'd dismissed as unscalable, a presentation considerably harder to give than the one I'd given 18 months earlier, but one that landed, I think, with more credibility precisely because of that difficulty. At the next full staff meeting, standing in front of the same sales floor where I'd once told my father his methods were outdated, I told our whole team plainly that the business's real underwriting advantage, the thing that had kept our default rates low for 4 decades, belonged to my father, and that I owed him credit I'd been too quick to think we no longer needed. The training sessions themselves became something I looked forward to more than I expected. I sat in on several of them, watching my father walk the 2 younger managers through what he actually listened for during a home visit. Not just the answers to his questions, but the pauses before them, the way a person's eyes moved when talking about money versus talking about their kids. Small tells he'd never once written down in 40 years because, he admitted to me one afternoon, he'd never had a reason to believe anyone would want to learn them from him. One of the managers, a woman named Priya, who joined us from a competing lot the year before, told me afterward that watching him work a kitchen table was like watching someone read a language she hadn't known existed, and that she suspected it would take her years to get even half as good at it as he'd become, without ever once calling it a skill. My father didn't make a show of any of it. He nodded once, thanked the 2 managers he was training for paying attention, and went back to his ledger, adding a new name to it in the same unhurried hand as the 41 before it, entirely unbothered by having just been credited, in front of the entire staff, with saving the business from a credit facility repricing that could have cost us real money the following year. His acceptance of the correction was exactly as measured as everything else about him, and I understood by then that this measured quality was the only kind of approval he'd ever really given anyone, and that I'd spent most of my adult life failing to recognize it as one. I don't know how to close a story like this with anything grander than what actually happened, which is that I spent 18 months believing my father's quiet agreement was surrender, when it was simply a man who decided not to argue with a decision he already knew the numbers would eventually correct on their own. There's a particular kind of pride that assumes a quiet man has run out of moves the moment he stops resisting where you can see it, and I carried that pride long enough that it nearly cost this business the one advantage that had kept it alive through 2 recessions before I was ever trusted to run a single lot, a pride I suspect most sons carry at some point, and most only ever set down the hard way, the way I finally did. I think now about that collections job he had in his 20s, knocking on doors before any of us existed, learning to read a person's whole situation off a doorstep in 30 seconds, and I understand now that the algorithm I built wasn't actually competing with an old man's outdated habit. It was competing with 50 years of training I'd never once accounted for in any spreadsheet, training that couldn't be digitized because it had never been written down anywhere except in the judgments he made, one kitchen table at a time. My father never raised his voice through any part of it. He never needed to. He kept doing the work quietly, on his own time, with his own money, for exactly as long as it took the numbers to say what he'd never once tried to say himself. I keep a copy of that ledger's first page in my own desk drawer now, not the original, which stays with him, but a photocopy Denise made for our files during the audit. I look at it sometimes on hard days, 41 names in his handwriting. A reminder that the most valuable thing this business ever had wasn't a system I could patent or a process I could scale, but a man willing to keep doing quiet, careful work long after his own son had told him it no longer mattered, simply because he still believed it did. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.